Well, good morning, good evening, everyone. Welcome to week 3. This week's topic is, what is the goal of the Buddhist path? What is the meaning of Tathagata and gone beyond? And what is the Buddhist understanding of authenticity, normality? This week, it's based on two of Zanskens Rinpoche's teachings or teaching cycles. One was a 3-day teaching given in Pune in India in December 2019 called The Way of the Tathagata. And the other is called Return to Normal, which was a 2-day teaching given in Taipei in October 2020. And in both cases, Rinpoche was talking about the goal of the Buddhist path, the way of the Tathagata, which is all about realizing our true nature, which we sometimes refer to as Buddha nature, or the nature of mind. And he used the words authenticity and normality to refer to this in these two teachings. But actually, he's talking about the same thing, just using different words. I'd like to start the way he started in his Return to Normal teaching. He said, so probably some of you may just want to be here for something like 10 minutes, which is fine. You're very welcome. But before you take off, I just want to tell you one thing that's probably a key to being authentic and being normal. And once you hear this, please feel free, go and have a good time. And in this teaching, I'm definitely not going to tell you how to pray or how to meditate. I'm not even going to tell you to do positive thinking. And I'm certainly not going to tell you to think about sunrises or rainbows, things like that. All I want you to do is just be aware of this moment, this nowness. It's not complicated at all. You don't even have to sit straight. I'm not asking you to invoke any kind of special thought or state of mind. All I'm asking you to do is to be conscious or aware of what's happening right now. And it could be something very, very ordinary and mundane. So let's just do that for a few moments. And that's it. That's all I'm asking. And if you have the appetite to do this, and I think you should, I'm asking you to do this at least once every day. You can't get more authentic or more normal than that. And there's also no better way to achieve authenticity or normality than this. Okay, so that's the sort of setup, which I think is rather lovely. Let's briefly look at structure. So we're going to start by talking a little bit about what is the spirit of the Tathagata, authenticity, normality. We'll talk about how that's understood in Buddhism, and Rinpoche uses the word authentic, which is quite lovely. We'll talk about what does that mean in the modern world, because it's also pretty important in psychology, in leadership. And we'll look at the similarities and the differences between the way it's understood in Buddhism and the way it's understood in psychology. We'll close by saying, even though there are differences, it's still important for us to understand and aspire for authenticity in the more worldly psychological sense. So we'll talk a little about that. Then we'll talk about mind. This idea that we all have mind, and mind is what we need to be able to follow the path. So we'll ask the questions, what is self and what is mind? Quite big questions. And that will hopefully take us to the break. After the break, we'll talk about how even though we have authenticity, we have this state of the Tathagata, we manage to lose it and misconstrue it. So we'll talk about how we try and look cool and fit in, how we're conditioned by our upbringing, culture, society, how we have wrong views, and even how we misunderstand and misconstrue the Buddha, how we have wrong views about what the goal of the path is. And I'll close that section by saying, yes, we have already got what's most precious, but we don't devote time for it. So, in conclusion, we need to practice. Now, strangely, even though we already have it, we don't realize this. So we have to practice in order to realize what we already have. We'll talk a little about how the Mahasiddhas realized the truth. Then we'll talk about the 10 seconds of awareness that Rinpoche introduced as a practice. We'll close with just some reflections on what it means to taste authenticity. All right, so he started by saying, really, to be a Buddhist, actually the most important thing is to admire the spirit or the principle of the Tathagata. It's not necessarily to do Buddhist homework, by which he means lots of study, lots of other practices. And I like this because it's actually widening the definition of what does it mean to consider oneself a Buddhist. I think some people might say, oh, to have a regular practice. Others might say, well, at the very least, we have to have taken refuge. But Rinpoche is saying, actually, no, even if the only thing you do is admire the spirit of the Tathagata, that's actually the most important thing. As we saw last week already, aspiration is key. If you think of yourself as a Buddhist, even if you've had lots of initiations, lots of teachings, but you don't deeply admire the spirit of the Tathagata, the nature of the Buddha, if that's not a goal or a way of being that you value, then you're not going to practice. So it won't matter how much you've received in the way of teachings. It won't help you. So what is authentic? Well, Rinpoche said, when we say Tathagata, it means something like an authentic presence or an authentic element. At very least, not a concoction, right? Not a combination of things. The traditional Buddhist word for not being a concoction is uncompounded or unconditioned. And actually, in each of the three yanas, the three vehicles of Buddhism, the result of the path is considered to be uncompounded, unconditioned. Right? In the Theravada, it's nirvana, or to accomplish the state of the arhat. In the Mahayana, it's to become a Tathagata or Buddha. In the Vajrayana, again, to become a Buddha, but more specifically to realize Rigpa, non-dual awareness. And in all of these vehicles, the reason that it's important philosophically for our goal to be uncompounded is that all compounded things, basic Buddhist view, are impermanent, right? They'll fall apart. Whatever's been put together or compounded is going to fall apart again. Which means if your result is going to fall apart, it's not really a reliable solution to the problems of samsara and worldly suffering. Right? So our view in the path is that although the result is uncompounded, the things that are getting in the way, right, the defilements, the negative emotions, the ignorance, that is considered compounded, impermanent, or adventitious, right? The word that means it's not really part of it, it's just something that's sort of added as an afterthought. Rinpoche often uses the example, and we'll come back to it, of a dirty window. And we can clean a window because the window itself, the glass, is actually clean, right? The dirt is on top of the glass, but we can wipe away the dirt. So when we say the window's dirty, actually no, the window isn't dirty. The window is still clean. It's just there's dirt on top of a clean window. And that's the sort of mindset we're going to need as we think about the path. Rinpoche also gave the example of cabbage and salad, right? And he said, having the raw cabbage is like the Tathagata. But once you add vinegar, salt, Thousand Island dressing, then you no longer have Tathagata. And so in this case, Tathagata can refer to a person, like the Buddha. And the Buddha himself referred to himself as Tathagata in many of the sutras, right? That was the way he termed himself. He didn't call himself Siddhartha or Shakyamuni or anything like that. And Rinpoche said, similarly, I know that I'm authentically a man, which gives me the confidence to go to the men's bathroom. Because if I'm unsure, I would be fidgety and I wouldn't know quite what to do. I think there he's pointing to a much bigger question of what does it mean to have confidence in one's true nature? Because as we'll proceed along the path, we'll talk a lot about things like spontaneity. And we can't be spontaneous if we're not confident in the basis of our spontaneity. So we'll come back to that. Okay, I wanted to, just because this word authenticity is going to be so important, I wanted to talk a little bit about how is it defined in the dictionary definitions. And actually, as I mentioned already, it's considered one of the highest goals in psychology, even in leadership. Right? Maslow, the psychologist, his idea of self-actualization, he termed it the full realization of one's potential and one's true self. Right? Very much an idea of authenticity. Right? Who doesn't want to be their best, their highest, their truest self, right? To live at their greatest potential. I think I was just thinking for any of you who are not native English speakers, I strongly encourage you to look up the definitions of the equivalent of authenticity in your language and just to see what does it mean and how is it thought about. But in English, a couple of meanings. Firstly, it means worthy of acceptance or belief as conforming to or based on fact. So for example, they said, this book paints an authentic picture of our society. A second definition is that it's not false or imitation, right? It's real and actual. And if you look up what real definition means, it's having an objective and independent existence. Also that it's not artificial, not fraudulent or illusory. It's genuine. And I think Rinpoche is using the word authentic when he talks about Tathagata in both of these senses, right? The first one was worthy of acceptance because it's based on fact. I think very much so. Although in this case, the fact is not so much a scientific fact established through experiment, but much more the first person fact of meditation experience. We talked last week about the Buddha and his teachings to the Kalamas, saying, go and experience for yourself and only then judge the validity of a teaching. And so similarly here, if we practice, we will come to learn and understand and experience our own nature, right? So it will be authentic to us. It'll be worthy of acceptance because we will have experience. And there's a much bigger question here, which we could talk about the nature of, the Buddhist idea of first-person experience versus the scientific idea of third-person experience, and what might it mean? Some people are saying that Buddhism should be considered some kind of science of the mind. A lot of people talk that way. A lot of other people disagree. We can come back to it in future weeks if you're interested. And the second sense, as I said, was that it's something real or actual, something not fake, not illusory. Of course, the problem in Buddhism is that all our appearances are illusory. And we know that in the Madhyamaka, all phenomena do not have an objective, independent existence, right? They're all interdependent. None are real in that sense of truly real. So start to ask ourselves, what does it mean then for something to be authentic and not illusory if it's not existing as some objective, independently real phenomenon? And hopefully that will immediately make you realize, okay, when we talk about the Buddha, the Tathagata, when we talk about authenticity, we're not talking about the same sorts of things as are in our ordinary world. Um, in Buddhism, we'll talk more about this, especially next week. We talk about both form and emptiness. We talk about how form is emptiness and emptiness is form. But one might apply that here to think about the form of our life that is in the world, right? The way we show up as humans, our jobs, our roles, as parents, as partners. But then also there is the beyond worldly, right? Our relationship to life that is free from worldly constraints. And they come together, and we often talk about them also in terms of wisdom and compassion, sort of loosely speaking, where the emptiness side often corresponds to wisdom, where we're free from the idea of true existence and true self and all the usual constraints we apply. And that is, for the benefit of self. We talk about being our own master, as we talked about last week, the Tathagata. The form side is more compassion, right? It's more how we design our lives. It's more the skillful means. It's the bodhisattva path. It's how we are of benefit to others. And this is also very important, right? We need to learn to treat people well, actually to treat beings well, other animals, all sentient beings. We need to learn to rehumanize them. Right? Too often we treat people as objects. We lack the basics of emotional intelligence. We lack the skills. We don't know how to live an authentic life. Right? We are so often pulled into a life that's about looking good, doing things just to fit in. Remember the top regret of the dying? I wish I'd had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life others expected of me. And in particular, part of our ordinary worldly life, if we are interested in the Dharma path, involves creating opportunities for study and practice, right? Both for meditation and modifying our life in post-meditation. How are we going to integrate the Dharma? So we'll talk a lot about that in the weeks ahead. I want to say, just in terms of Rinpoche's approach, he places a very strong emphasis on view and on wisdom, whereas a lot of contemporary teachers are much more focused on compassion, on meditation, on changing our worldly life, all of which is great. But as Rinpoche cautions us, as we talked in the first week, this can end up just as a version of self-help or perhaps philanthropy. And so we really want to challenge ourselves. How can we do both? Both the worldly version of authenticity, living well, living with wisdom and compassion, but also the beyond worldly, to really get to awakening. And the other thing about Rinpoche is he's from a lineage, a family of yogis. Right? So he has actually very little emphasis on the specific form that one might follow in worldly life. Right? He's very happy for people to live pretty much in any way they want. I mean, his students literally run the gamut from sort of CEOs and government ministers and billionaires through to homeless people and kind of vagrants and prostitutes, and they'll all show up at teachings together. I mean, it's quite amazing. But for him, there's very little requirement that one's external life should look a certain way. So I think that that's also very important as we go forwards and keep asking, well, what does it look like to integrate Buddhism into our lives? I think one thing we'll start to realize, it's much less about what we're doing and much more about how we're being. I know we've said this before, but we'll keep coming back to this. I just want to read a brief excerpt from his Madhyamaka teachings in 1996. He said, when we talk about truth, it is like a basic instinct that we have. Truth is something that we adopt, and that which is not true or fake is something that we do not adopt. For example, we distinguish between genuine Italian leather, the truth, and fake leather made in Thailand. Of course, you should notice that without the imitation, there is no such thing as something genuine. If it were not for imitations, advertisers could not brag about how genuine their products are. But in the ordinary world, distinctions such as fake and truth, genuine and imitation are completely taken for granted. There's not much reasoning behind them. The decisions are mostly made by common or majority agreement, or by direct cognition, such as when you touch the fire and it's hot, you decide that's what is hot. That's as far as it goes, and it doesn't go very far. But Chandrakirti does not believe in genuine leather. Well, he believes in genuine leather, in other words, in the conventional truth, but not in truly existing genuine leather, in other words, in the ultimate truth. So, yes, we will talk about authenticity in the world, but always to recall that the result, right, the Buddha, the Tathagata, it is beyond aspiration. It is beyond this world. It's not a thing we can identify and aspire to. And if we try and turn this non-duality, the state of the Buddha, into something fixed, we've already missed it. So one of the really big challenges whenever we talk about Buddha or enlightenment is that there is indeed a result to which we aspire, but we can't grasp it with concepts or with language. And I think especially for newcomers to Buddhism, this is incredibly frustrating, right? Because you're like, well, hey, you're telling me the most important thing is Buddhahood, the Tathagata, and you're telling me you can't even talk about it? So we'll have to figure out how to, how can we talk about something that cannot be talked about? Okay, he also talked about Tathagata itself. I know I've used this word already a few times, as uncontrived and unfabricated. So it's a little bit like this uncompounded and unconditioned. So uncontrived means, it's natural, it doesn't have the false appearance or false quality. Unfabricated means not invented, not created, not made up, especially not made up for the purposes of deception. So again, just take 10 seconds. Just be aware what's happening right now. Okay, so uncontrived is I find a much more helpful word than uncompounded, even though uncompounded is the philosophical word, just because uncontrived also has an everyday meaning, right? We have a sense of what it means in our normal lives. With this sense of living without a kind of contrivances and fakeness and made up, putting on airs, all that kind of thing. So we have two ideas which come together, subtly different, right? Authentic, more around this idea of being true to yourself, right? Living according to your values and so forth, more a positive statement. Whereas uncontrived is more a negative statement, right? It's more about living naturally, living spontaneously, living without deceptions, right? So uncontrived is more about things that we're free from. So going beyond any and all of our self-descriptions and self-narratives. Actually, so these two, they have a connection also between the worldly and beyond worldly, wisdom and compassion, as I already mentioned. So I'll talk a little bit about how do we understand authenticity in the modern world. So I looked up a few references from psychology. I'll put them all in the transcript. So one was, it's about living authentically as a common exhortation, but what does it actually mean? As a psychological concept, authenticity simply means embracing who you really are at your very core and acting in accordance with your own values and beliefs. Another one. Being authentic means coming from a real place within. It's when our actions and words are congruent with our beliefs and values. It's being ourselves, not an imitation of what we think we should be or have been told we should be. There is no should in authentic. But wait a minute, if being authentic means being our true self, how many of us have really taken the time to know ourselves on this deep level? Part of knowing ourselves is knowing what we believe in. Throughout our childhoods, we're picking up messages that become part of our belief system. Left unchallenged, we can walk around thinking that these beliefs are our own. Part of finding our authentic self is sorting through these beliefs to find out which are truly our own. Are they beliefs that come from a mature, healthy, grounded place within us? Or are they remnants from our childhood, coming from an insecure place? So that was Diane Motti at Psych Central. Okay, this is from Bill George, who's professor at Harvard Business School. He says, to be effective leaders of people, authentic leaders must first discover the purpose of their leadership. If they don't, they are at the mercy of their egos and narcissistic impulses. To discover their purpose, authentic leaders have to understand themselves and the passions that animate their life stories. Okay, so there's one set of definitions then around sort of knowing ourselves, acting in ways that are true to ourselves. Okay, another one continues on this idea of knowing who we really are. So this is Stephen Joseph from Psychology Today. He said, to live an authentic life, it's not enough simply to try to be ourselves. We also need to know ourselves and own ourselves. To be authentic, we need to be able to face up to the truth about ourselves, no matter how unpleasant we might find it. Authentic people are honest with themselves. They challenge and question themselves. They look for ways in which they're being self-deceptive and try to see things from different angles. They know what they think, but they're willing to change their views if new information comes their way. Authentic people know themselves. They're able to listen to their inner voice, their gut, and to understand the complexities of their feelings and hear their own inner wisdom. Okay, finally, the idea that even if we're able to be honest with ourselves, the self isn't something fixed. It's a work in progress. So this is from Herminia Ibarra, who's a Charles Handy Professor of Organizational Behavior at London Business School, a real expert in the field of organization and change. And she said, authenticity has become the gold standard for leadership, but a simplistic understanding of what it means can hinder your growth and limit your impact. Because going against our natural inclinations can make us feel like imposters. We tend to latch onto authenticity as an excuse for sticking with what's comfortable. Career advances require all of us to move way beyond our comfort zones. At the same time, however, they trigger a strong, countervailing impulse to protect our identities. When we're unsure of ourselves, or our ability to perform well or measure up in a new setting, we often retreat to familiar behaviors and styles. But the moments that most challenge our sense of self are the ones that can teach us the most about leading effectively. By viewing ourselves as works in progress and evolving our professional identities through trial and error, we can develop a personal style that feels right to us and suits our organization's changing needs. That takes courage because learning, by definition, starts with unnatural and often superficial behaviors that can make us feel calculating instead of genuine and spontaneous. But the only way to avoid being pigeonholed and ultimately become better leaders is to do the things that a rigidly authentic sense of self would keep us from doing. Okay, so I think these are actually quite helpful as definitions because it helps us see some of the differences and similarities between a Buddhist understanding of authenticity and how we define it in psychology and in leadership. So I'd say quite a few similarities. I mean, firstly, going back to the 3 marks we touched on already. So anicca, impermanence. We're all works in progress, right? And being authentic means accepting there is no one fixed version of ourself, but actually it's changing all the time. Right? We don't have a fixed reference. Secondly, we talked about dukkha, right? The unsatisfactoriness. And just this idea that facing the truth about ourselves is hard. Self-deception is very common. Right? Even trying to change in ways that more embody the person we desire to be feels unnatural, feels uncomfortable. Right? So much about authenticity is difficult, uncomfortable, painful, even in the ordinary psychological sense. Anatta, non-self. Right? We need to learn to see ourselves not as something fixed, but a work in progress. And I think we talked about being one's own master. We are all accountable for our authenticity, for our self-authorship. Nobody else can do it for us. Right? Authenticity isn't something you can delegate or find an answer to in a book or in a therapist. Right? You have to do it yourself. I actually think also in terms of practice advice, oddly, the two I found most compelling were from leadership professors, perhaps because they deal with a practical world. But I think Herminia Ibarra's comment on change not feeling genuine and spontaneous, I think the same is true for us as Dharma practitioners. Right? For beginners especially, Dharma practice will not feel intuitive. It won't feel right at the beginning. It won't feel comfortable, precisely because we're challenging our habits. Yeah, and that's part of the reason Rinpoche always says we do need to spend some time doing hearing, contemplation, meditation before we practice or to support our practice. And we need an intellectual understanding and conviction, because if we just rely on our emotions, that won't be enough, because very often our emotions will be screaming at us, this feels wrong, this isn't the right thing to do. I also like Bill George's comment where he said, we need a clear purpose so we're not at the mercy of our egos and narcissistic impulses. Again, something we've talked about already, but how on the Dharma path, it's very easy, even as we're trying to transcend and tame and conquer our egos are very strong and resilient, right? They'll find a way of taking the Dharma path and twisting it, right, to suit themselves. Very easy to get spiritually materialistic, to get narcissistic, to let your Buddhist practice and identity become something ego clings to. Yeah, so we really need clarity of purpose to make sure we don't fall into those traps, which are very real on the path. So that's what's similar. Okay, what's different? Well, I would say the biggest difference between psychology and Dharma is the kinds of places we're willing to look, right? Because psychology is very much looking still at our minds in the world. Psychology still believes in a self, whereas Dharma is looking beyond this inner dimension of feelings, thoughts, and experiences to this innermost dimension of awareness. We talked about this in the first week. Because we know right from the ultimate truth, there is no true self of either a person or phenomena. It's all an illusion, a magical display. Our aim is to go beyond all views because all views are false. Right? So once we understand that, it completely changes our relationship to the self, to the world, and then becomes the foundation for our awakening. Right? No longer being trapped inside our current hopes and fears and limited ways of thinking about our worldly life, right? Our current way of living. In other words, getting to this state of uncontrived, unfabricated, the lettuce rather than the salad with the Thousand Island. I think the other thing is the idea of being true to oneself or defining one's true self. Now, we saw already that many authors like Herminia Ibarra don't believe in a true self because self is changing all the time. But I think there are other people in psychology and a lot of self-help literature would have you believe you do have a true self, and your purpose is to try and somehow discover or uncover it. Again, from a Buddhist point of view, actually even from a psychological point of view, from a Buddhist point of view, that's a big mistake because there's nothing there to discover or uncover. We don't believe in a true self, nor do we believe in all the sort of clinging and the attachment that that would imply, right? Because once you get into that idea of a true self, all of a sudden there's so much fixation that comes. So as I said, I think the best Western psychologists and leadership professors do understand this. I think the big difference is, unlike Buddhism, they don't have a path, right? They know it is true that there is no fixed self. They understand it intellectually, but they don't have a path, a set of practices to realize it, right? I think that's where Buddhism can offer a tremendous amount to psychology, in that, yes, we accept the idea there is no true self, self is a work in progress, but rather than just talk about it, we can help you realize it. Yeah, I think the other big difference is just as I said already, if you accept the Dharma and follow the path, you realize that part of your life design has to incorporate Dharma. Ideally, all of your life design. So, you know, In fact, even the idea of what is good, what is meritorious, right? In the Dharma, the definition of good or merit all comes down to whether it supports realization of the truth, right? This applies to teachings, teachers, our thoughts, our behaviors, our way of living, right? Hence the whole discussion on skillful means. Right, we'll come back to this much more when we talk about compassion and being in the world in the last couple of weeks. But just to say, you know, we can't talk about authenticity as a Dharma practitioner unless our worldly living also makes space for our Dharma, right? Because otherwise we're ignoring something that's profoundly important to us. So although in Buddhism, we talk about authenticity beyond the worldly understanding, it is nevertheless still important to have authenticity in worldly terms. We'll come back to this, but this idea of living authentically in the world, Rinpoche taught a couple of times over the past year or so, encouraging us to think for ourselves, what do we mean by things like wealth, health, happiness? Right? What does it mean to us to live a good life? And in particular, he's challenging us to move from a more conventional outer worldly definition to more of an inner definition. So on his teaching Resilience he gave in January to an audience in Bhutan, he said, how about being more creative in how you define things? Your definitions of success and wealth and happiness, how you value things. For example, wealth, to be rich. He said, right now I think a lot of us have a certain definition of wealth, being rich, prosperity, and our definition is based on the general idea that's held by society. But I think we can be quite creative about this. Yes, for some people, having many cars, many properties, lots of assets, a large bank balance, maybe that's their definition of being rich and wealthy. But for others, maybe not. And here you can be creative. Maybe you can define wealth in terms of thinking, okay, this is enough. Some sort of contentment. Maybe that can be the definition of wealth. And likewise, how do we define happy? Happy is very subjective, very general, but again, we can be creative. It's really not wise to rely on definitions or meanings imposed by school, advertising agencies, and all those big companies. Basically, we don't have to be so uncreative in following definitions that are imposed by others. Yeah, so even though, as Buddhists, our aim is to seek freedom from worldly life, right? To be able to be in the world but not constrained by the world, nevertheless, we can also aim for greater authenticity, greater freedom in the way we choose to live. Right? In psychology and adult development theory, this is called self-authorship. Right? The idea that we write our own story about who we are rather than follow scripts written by somebody else. One of the best authors on this is Robert Keegan, a professor at Harvard. And he talks about self-authorship in terms of a shift of meaning-making capacity from something outside the self to inside the self. A person takes values, beliefs, convictions, generalizations, ideals, abstractions, interpersonal loyalties, and even intrapersonal states, thoughts, feelings, emotions, as objects or elements of its system rather than the system. It does not identify with them, but views them as part of a new whole. This new whole is an ideology, an internal identity, a self-authorship that can coordinate, integrate, act upon, or invent values, beliefs, convictions, generalizations, ideals, abstractions, and so forth. It is no longer authored by them, it authors them, and thereby achieves a personal authority. Right? So it's a shift from uncritically accepting values and beliefs from external authorities to formulating them internally. So we become the coordinator of defining our beliefs, our identity, our social relations, while critically considering, examining, questioning the perspectives of others externally. Again, very much a Buddhist way of thinking, right? This idea of not just taking things for granted. And of course, originally the Buddha said don't take his teachings for granted, but even more so, don't take for granted what you read in the news, right? The way advertising agencies and social media are trying to sell you things. So this is another level of being your own master. Yeah, not just at the level of behaviors, of generosity, of patience, non-reactivity, emotional maturity, but actually taking accountability for how you approach your whole life, right? Your goals, your purpose, your values, your relationships, your way of living. As we said in the first week, right? You are ultimately accountable, right? So in that sense, the worldly side of authenticity very much places that accountability on you. Very much in psychology and in Dharma, we would agree you are your own master. Okay, so just going back to our outline. So we've covered the first section, talking a little bit about authenticity, sort of transition now to talking about mind, how we have already got what we need. And so the word Tathagata, which we've been using, so the Sanskrit tata means something like as it is, or that itself. That's kind of an isness or a thusness. And gata means come, but also gone, right? It means both departed and arrived. As Rinpoche says, it's one of those wonderful Indian words that has a sort of non-dual meaning built into it. So he says Tathagata really means something like gone and arrived from where you never departed. Which brings back my favorite T.S. Eliot quote, Little Gidding. I'll read it again, I love it so much. We shall not cease from exploration, and at the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. Yeah. So arriving where we started, knowing it for the first time, that's very much the spirit of the Tathagata. As we said, it's very much what we mean by the hero's journey, what we mean by transformation. And in Mahayana, Rinpoche said, gone beyond also has this important meaning of going beyond both samsara and nirvana, right? Going beyond all conventional ideas, not just of bad, but also of good. He quoted Nagarjuna. He said, but you've never said there is liberation by abandoning samsara, but you have said that the inherent non-existence of samsara is nirvana. Okay, so we'll increasingly see this, right? We'll see these references in the Mahayana pointing to the Tathagata, pointing to authenticity as something non-dual, right? Beyond our ordinary concepts, our ordinary understanding. So then we ask, okay, well, what is self? We say the best way to achieve authenticity is to become one's own master, self-mastery. But what is the self that we're mastering? Rishi said the classic answer is we say, form is emptiness, emptiness is form, but that's very abstract. Right? What does it mean? So I guess in the ordinary world, what would we mean by self? We mean a body, life story, our degree, our job. But actually, above all, it's our mind, right? Our mind is the most important. We are sentient beings, right? The Tibetan word for that is samchan, which actually means endowed with mind, right? So the whole definition of a sentient being is that we have mind. Moshe said, look, the fact that we get lonely, bored, the fact we feel ignored, we get jealous, we get competitive, we have insecurities, all this is a sign that we have mind. Table doesn't get insecure. It doesn't get jealous if I sit at another desk. It doesn't get lonely when nobody's in the room with it. And likewise, if you're walking in the forest and a branch falls from the tree and injures you, it's not because the tree was intending you any harm. So yes, we have mind, but also I think, Rinpoche underlined have, right? We can't get rid of it. Yeah, you can shave your hair. You can even cut off your finger like they do in the Yakuza. But you can't get rid of mind, right? As he said, we're stuck with mind. And sometimes we really feel like we'd like to get rid of it. Sometimes it's very painful. We experience existential angst, boredom, loneliness, anxiety, depression. Yeah, many people experienced a lot of this during COVID. Yeah, so we try to numb ourselves. We try to distract ourselves. Of course, alcohol, drugs, social media, overworking, all kinds of addictions. But if you know how to handle the mind, as the great Mahasiddha Saraha said, it is the most precious thing. Indeed, even our ordinary worldly mind, Saraha prostrates to it because he says, because of this mind, we have our ups and downs, we have happiness and sadness. And so that leads us to wonder, is there something I can do about all of this emotional turmoil, this unsatisfactoriness of my ordinary condition? And that leads us to seek the truth. And that leads us ultimately to authenticity and the state of the Buddha. So, even there we can prostrate to our ordinary mind. We can be grateful that we have this because if we just pay attention, it's what's going to lead us onto the path. Now, what is mind? That's the next question. It's not our brain. It's not intelligence. And as Rinpoche said, if I say it's cognizance, you have to chew it with a kilo of salt. Right, just dictionary definition. Cognizance means to notice or to give attention to something. I mean, in Tibetan, this is selwa, which means clarity, luminosity. Corresponds to the Sanskrit prabhasvara, which is something like brilliant or bright or shining. Right? It's that notion that even though a computer or a robot can be aware of its environment, it can even develop an internal state. Right? It can calculate what is it seeing. Is it standing on a certain kind of surface? But despite the awareness, we wouldn't say that a computer or a robot, at least not yet, doesn't have mind in the sense of cognizance, right? It doesn't have that sense of an experience or an awareness of itself. Roche said, when the Buddha was asked what is mind, he gave in one answer 3 definitions, which include 2 contradictions. Right? This is from the 8,000-line Prajnaparamita Sutra, which is probably considered one of the original texts of the Mahayana. He said, mind, there is no mind. Mind is luminous. This is just this short line. It's like the spine of the Mahayana Buddhist studies. And so just like mind we're not inanimate, right? Like tables. Likewise, enlightenment is not like being a stone or wood, right? It's not inanimate like a table. You have cognizance. So back to the AI example, this is what is termed a hard problem, right? We know that the self-driving car is aware of its environment but has no cognizance, right? So again, we use words like self-awareness, meta-awareness, reflexive awareness. But just to say, when we talk about mind in Buddhism, right, this is what we're referring to, right? This cognizance. We're not referring just to our ordinary thoughts or emotions or assumptions or beliefs. We're talking about the observer, right, that is experiencing or able to be aware of or to experience all of these different inner states. As Rinpoche said, it's not like it requires lifetimes of practice. You can experience it right now. So again, let's spend 10 seconds just being aware of what's happening right now. Okay. So that's going to be the end of our first session. We'll come back in 10 minutes. And what we're going to talk about next is talk more about this painful part of the mind. right? The painful part being that it can be confused, which is something that a table doesn't have. But the good news is it can be awakened from confusion also. So with that, I'll see you in 10 minutes. Hello and welcome back. In case any of you are wondering, that music actually is, it's called the Disintegration Loops by an experimental composer called William Basinski. I quite like it. I think it's, maybe it doesn't sound very Buddhist, but the conception I think is quite Buddhist. He took an old recording on a magnetic tape and he played it over and over and over and over again until the tape started to decay. And he recorded the various stages of the decay of the tape. The entire recording is, I think it's like 7 or 8 hours long. It's a long thing. Anyway, just this idea of what is the true self of that recording. What does it mean to have an authentic version as it slowly ages and decays into nothingness? All right, where are we? So we're now going to talk about how we have this authenticity, this normality, right? This Tathagata state. We have this authentic presence. We have this cognizance, but somehow we lose it, right? We misconstrue the Tathagata. Instead of understanding, it's so hard to understand non-duality, we misconstrue it and project something else onto it instead. So I want to talk a little bit about how we do that. So firstly, just as Rinpoche said, we don't actually end up becoming our own master because we're too busy trying to look cool, right? To look good, to impress people, to fit in. And even in psychology and leadership, we'd say that a lot of our problems stem from basic insecurities around looking good and fitting in. In other words, personal and social identity. Or as Rinpoche says, we might experience the authentic state, right? The state of just pure awareness of just what's going on right now. But it can be so scary because it's so unfamiliar. It's strange, it's unbearable. So we fish out our phone to entertain ourselves, to numb ourselves, to divert our minds to something else. And of course, as we do this, we end up becoming the victims of others, of socializing. We worry about fitting in and not being left out. We even want our kids to be a certain way, to fit into a certain class in society. And of course, as we do this over the years, we learn to be fake. As Rinpoche said, even if we were in a completely deserted wilderness with no people, we would still be uncomfortable walking naked. So all of this, right, this sort of confusion, these defilements, we talk about in Buddhism as the kleshas. They distract you, they cover up your true nature, and we'll talk more about them in future weeks. So I don't want to go into them now. But Rinpoche just continued with this notion of like how we get caught up and distract ourselves. He says, in the West, people are very concerned with asking, what is, my life's purpose? But he said, actually, a Buddhist question would much rather be, what is the nature of this self, especially mind? Because he said, people who are so worried about purpose, about being career-driven, diploma-driven, status-driven, they fear irrelevance. Hence, things like TikTok, right, numbs you and gives you a temporary life purpose. Also, when he was teaching in Taipei, he said, you also get things like people building these super tall skyscrapers like Taipei 101, which was, officially the world's tallest building for its opening in 2004 till 2010. It was 1,671 feet. Beat the previous one, which was the Preciousness Twin Towers in Kuala Lumpur at 1,483 feet. And then, of course, there's always something bigger and better, right? So in 2010, Dubai has the Burj Khalifa at 2,717 feet, right? But I think Rinpoche's point is, whether it's getting caught up in TikTok or getting caught up in building the world's tallest super skyscraper, is there much difference? He said something lovely. He said, people ask me, what should they buy for their pet dog? They talk about dog therapy, dog sadness, cat sadness. Some people even have snakes. What to do with this? All these worries. Some people worry about dog food. Some people worry about the 2020 US election. What's the difference? There's not so much difference, is there? It's just a trick. It's just a hallucination we're going through at the moment. So as he said, to be normal, forget your purpose, your values, maybe just for 10 seconds. All right, so in addition to kind of the self-distraction, we also find it difficult to be authentic because of our conditioning. Right? We touched on this already, but Roche shared a couple of such lovely stories that I really wanted to go over them with you. First, he talked about his childhood in Bhutan. And he said, maybe I didn't really grow up in the jungle, but I definitely grew up in the forest. And relatively speaking, I used to know a little bit about the forest. I knew what kind of mushrooms you can eat and what kind of mushrooms you should avoid. But even some of this knowledge is now gone because most of the mushrooms I eat are from 7-Eleven. I think I'm still good at making fires, but there aren't so many places to make fires now. At the age of around 6 or 7, I was taken away from my family. Actually, I was sold. I'm not exaggerating, this is true, and there's a reason for this. In the Himalayas, as many as you know, the culture believes in recognizing reincarnation and so forth. So just when I was having a really good time in this subtropical place among the elephants, rhinoceroses, and big pythons, some people turned up one day to take me away. Some strangers turned up and told me that I was the reincarnation of some person. It's a bit like if some Austrians came to you and said, hey, you have to go to Austria because you are Mozart's incarnation. Anyway, I was sold for a cheap rate, but not because my family had 7 children. I guess for my family it was sort of an honor. That money, that fare or price was important. It's the custom that when the child is given to whoever's taking them away, the parents will give the price. It's to symbolize the family has no more say over their child. The property or the commodity belongs to someone else. So yes, that was the end of being with my family. So I don't have a photo that's complete with all my family all together. There's always me missing most of the time. Once I left, I was made to study things that were written 2,500 years ago. And in fact, I have to say, over half a century, I'm still studying things that were written 2,500 years ago. I've been educated and influenced to think I'm Bhutanese, and I'm a Buddhist. So, nice story. I think, as we've done in previous weeks, I just invite you just to reflect on the ways in which your own life experience causes you to have a very fixed notion, a fixed conditioning, which limits your idea of authenticity. He continues, he was talking about being in Taiwan. He said, I got up a few extra hours early to finish my daily Buddhist meditation so I could catch the debate between Trump and Biden. And I got emotionally engaged when one of them misbehaved. And then the other one fumbled and my hand sweated. Isn't it amazing? A man who was born amidst lavender and bamboo has now reached this level. This man worries about the fate of the United States. So much changes in our life. Our values, the way we see things, everything. I grew up in India watching voluptuous Indian girls dancing in Bollywood movies. Now among the Indian elites, girls are trying to look like toothpicks. All just to fit in and ensure we won't be left out. Bhutan's natural sport is archery, but I worry more about the Barcelona football team. I even know the names of the Barcelona football players. I think I used to remember even their birthdays. The final story. He was talking, there was a question and answer, and somebody asked him to say, well, what's a normal day like for you as a Rinpoche? And he told a lovely story of when he'd been traveling in China many years ago. He said, I was traveling there for some time. In those days, that part of China was very remote, so we had to travel by horse. And I hate riding a horse because there's no seatbelt and everything. I just don't like it. And sometimes you're riding a horse by a cliff. It's very scary. Anyway, there was a guy who helped me ride and held me. So towards the end of my trip, as we were coming closer to the motor road, I gave him my watch as a gift because he'd really been helping me. I don't remember what watch it was, but it was quite a good brand. So I gave it to him saying, you should wear this. This is a good watch. And after a few days, I saw he wasn't wearing it, and I asked him, I gave you a watch, why aren't you wearing it? And he said, no, I am wearing it. And he took off his locket that he was wearing around his neck. Of course, the locket was much smaller than the original watch. And he opened it, and by then, he'd already completely disassembled the watch. And in his locket, he had what appeared to be the main engine. All the other parts, the wrist strap, everything else, he'd cut and given to his family members. And he was a little bit embarrassed, and he confessed, saying, I kept the best part, the engine. So, yeah, just some lovely context from Rinpoche's life. What does normality mean? How are we even to begin to judge what's normal for another person? And of course, I mean, Rinpoche has talked often about what does this mean for Dharma coming to the West, especially when it's taught by teachers who are educated and brought up in systems, in cultures and traditions very, very different from our modern educated Western world. How do we solve the challenge of translation, of mutual understanding, when our contexts, when our ideas of normal are just so different? Okay, the next topic, just back to our outline, is the third one, so 3C, on wrong views. And the classic example in Buddhism is the rope and the snake. Right, so you imagine that you're in a darkened room, and you can see something lying on the floor. You think it's a snake. You get scared, you jump back, you turn on the light, you see it's just a rope. So as Rinpoche said, how interesting. We experience the fear of a snake that doesn't exist. We're trying to get rid of a problem that has no base. And of course, that's an analogy for ego itself, right? As Buddhist philosophy demonstrates, there is no such thing as a self, right? A truly existing fixed self. And yet we cling to it as if there were. And then, of course, once we start with that clinging, all the other negative emotions, the hope, the fear, everything else comes. And where does the fear come from? Well, it comes from habit. And, we've been doing this for so long. We've been relating to the world in this way. We've been taught to relate to the world in this way. So another example, he said, look, so if that's wrong view, well, another way of thinking about Tathagata, actually even the word, it can refer to having the right view. And having the right view, realizing the right view, is awakening, it is liberation. So he gave the example of a demon dance. He said it's a little bit like a child looking at a stage where there's a performance. There's a demon dance. The child gets scared. But the moment the child goes behind the stage and realizes it's just a masked performance, then that's the end. It's the end of the illusion of the demon. The child has discovered the view. Now, whether the child then continues to watch the dance, that depends on their motivation, their companion, and so on. So the point here is that when we talk about the result, it's really much more important to think about, as Rinpoche says, a shift in attitude. Right? It's a realization of a new view. And we'll talk about this much more starting next week. Much more important than what we see, these images of Buddhas with halos, or read about all these enlightened qualities. And actually, this idea of awareness and view, even when it comes to worldly authenticity, right? This idea of knowing ourselves, making better choices about our purpose and our values and our way of living, awareness is very important for that, right? Awareness of our current state, of our root causes, right? Why is our life the way it is? Why do we behave the way we do? And what would we like? How can we imagine ourselves? What is our desired mindset, our desired view, our desired way of living? How can we change it? So for all of those, this cultivation, this 10 seconds of awareness is so important. Or she also said in passing, your mind in its natural state is like water, but it's currently frozen. Now, throughout these teachings, he was actually talking about the Mahasiddhas, especially Saraha, I'm quoting from Saraha, and there's a quote here from Saraha's King Doha, verse 17, which is, "When icy winds gust over water, what was fluid becomes like stone. So, with our distorted beliefs, we fools solidify the formless." So we'll talk much more about view starting next week. But just for now, just to say, wrong view is part of the defilements, part of the ignorance, part of what stops us seeing the Tathagata, the authentic state. And a lot of the path is in identifying and then disassembling these wrong views. So now to talk about how part of the way a wrong view shows up is how we project the Buddha. Right? Because we've said many times, you can experience this enlightened, awakened state, but you can't talk about it or conceptualize it. Well, it's not that you can't talk about it. You can write poems, you can sing songs of realization, like Saraha and his dohas, but you can't describe it in a rational, conceptual way. It is beyond that. Right? I mean, it is that which holds all our thoughts, our awareness. So how can we find words for that raw cognizance? He said, what is sanity? Now, to even answer your question, I already need to use language, which is already not normal. Once I have surrendered to language, sanity is gone. That's why the great masters of the past kept quiet. It's like if you've kind of fallen off a cliff with your arms bound behind you and you grabbed onto a branch with your teeth. If somebody asks you how you're doing, the moment you say anything, you will fall. And that's how it is with talking about the awakened state. There was a question about, well, okay, but can we even talk about the experience of what it's like to be a Buddha? I mean, do our normal everyday appearances, you say, they're like a magic show, you say, but do they continue? Does the dream continue after enlightenment? And Hiramshe said, well, go back to the idea of a magic show. It's a different, spin on a demon dance. The audience watches the show and is just totally transfixed and taken in by the magic. It's amazing, it's entertaining, it's addictive, it's enthralling. The magician, of course, he's playing the game, but he knows it's an illusion, right? He may be conjuring up a trick, and he knows the trick is a trick. He's not taken in by it. So you could say he has something much closer to a correct understanding, a correct view. But he said for the Buddha, he's not even an audience. For him, nothing has happened. There's no dream, there is no awakening. And indeed, in the Mahayana, as Rinpoche said, we talk about the three kayas. We can talk about this in future weeks also, Dhammakaya, Sambhogakaya, Nimanakaya. Don't worry too much about that now. But just to say, the Nimanakaya, the manifest aspect of the Buddha, that's considered a display, right? All phenomena, the manifest aspect of anything, are considered an illusory display, just like a magic show. Likewise, all teachings are just a display. They're not true in some ultimate sense. They're just pointing us towards truth, skillful means. So let's ask them, well, what is the state of the mind of an enlightened being? And here Rinpoche told a lovely story, which is, I think, from the Avatamsaka Sutra, the Flower Ornament Sutra. It's about two Buddhas called Kuntuzik and Sanjay Kamalagawa. So one of these Buddhas, the one called Sanjay Kamalagawa, his name means the Buddha who enjoys the stars. The other Buddha is Kuntuzik. It's the all-knowing Buddha. It's basically when Manjushri, who's supposedly still a bodhisattva, finally attains enlightenment, his name will be Kuntuzik, the all-knowing Buddha, or the Buddha who gazes at everything. So these two Buddhas are having a conversation, and Sanjay Kamalagawa, the one who enjoys the stars, he talks about how his Buddha field, right, his realm, is as big as the size of a thumb, and the duration of his Buddha field, from its beginning to its end, is like the duration of a spark coming out of a fire. You know, like that. That's it. Finished. Now, Kuntuzik, right, Manjushri as a Buddha, his Buddha field is infinite. The duration of his Buddha field is endless. Now, these two Buddhas are talking about space and time, and they realize it's all a trick. Because the moment we think in terms of infinite, we think of big, especially those of us who are not mathematically trained. But no, it doesn't mean big. In here, when we talk about an infinite Buddha field, it means measureless, right? It's beyond any kind of measure, beyond any kind of thought or conception. Right? The Buddha field of the other Buddha is measured. It's thumb size, has the duration of a spark. But actually, as they talk, they realize they're talking about the same thing. It's like, oh, I thought yours was so small and so thumb size, but I realize actually it's as big as mine. So I wanted to include the story, just again, another kind of pointer, another taste to what do we mean when we talk about the Buddha as being beyond duality, beyond our everyday rational conceptual understanding. Rinpoche also said, look, even when we talk about the traditional 32 major marks and 80 minor marks, the descriptions of the qualities of the Buddha that you get in the Theravada Sutras, Rinpoche says, if you read about the Buddha's qualities, the Buddha is supposedly very beautiful to look at. No matter how much you look at him, you'll never be satisfied. You just want to look and look and look some more. Supposedly, one of his disciples, Madhgalyayana, looked at him for many eons. And then there are many descriptions about his beautiful qualities, these 32 major marks and 80 minor marks. But if you read them, some of them are very strange. He has antelope-like ankles. His body width and height are exactly the same. He's boxy, really? Is that beautiful? And he has an Upanisha. Would you date someone with a giant lump on their head? His skin is golden colored. Well, maybe if you're a kid and you like Star Wars, you might think it's cool to hang out with someone who's kind of plated with gold. But, as Rinpoche said, these things are difficult. They're actually intended to throw you, to pull the rug out from under your feet again and again. So we'll find this a lot, especially in the Mahayana. Part of our establishing the view is to realize that there is no ultimate view. And so a lot of the path then involves this pulling the rug from under our feet, right? Deconstructing all these relative views, all these ways that we think we found something that's true and stable and right, but we haven't. And I just wanted to think a little bit about this, just in terms of the way the Buddha is represented artistically. I will say, by the way, the Google form for questions is open. If you would like to submit any questions for the questions and answer session starting in about half an hour, please do so. There's certainly scope for more there for me to answer. So I'd like to just spend a moment looking at this idea of projection, right? So classic is this. These are from Rorschach, right? His used them in psychology, the so-called ink blots, right? And there was a practice still used actually in psychoanalysis where you're invited to look at these ink blots and say, what do you see? I think it's, even this is quite, I'm sure for each of us, something is suggested by this. So I think the reason I wanted to show you this is just to make the point about projection. Right? Usually we have an idea, we have an image, we don't think of it as a projection, right? So these images are nice because they're not obviously about anything in particular. Okay, so let's transition to Buddhist images. Okay, so on the left we have a classic Gandhara Buddha. Right, so Gandhara was what is now between northwestern Pakistan and eastern Afghanistan. And the kingdom was there roughly between the 1st century BCE and the 7th century. And the first, depictions of Buddha in a sort of human form were done by kind of Greek artists, right? There's a lot of, Alexander the Great, and he brought a lot of artists with him. So there's a lot of Greco-Roman and especially Greek influence in Central Asia in those times. As you see the early Buddhas, they look like Greek statues like this. Now, Rinpoche says these are some of his favorite Buddha images. I certainly love them also. But I think we look at that and we think, is that really, how I would project the Buddha? So then the second image, that is the Buddha inside the Mahabodhi temple in Bodh Gaya, right, where the Buddha attained enlightenment. So this is, it's a sandstone Buddha, painted obviously, but from the Pala period, which was 8th to 12th century in India. Actually, was only reinstated in the temple in 1884 when the British colonial government began to restore it because it had all fallen into disrepair. But even there, so here would be, I would say, a fairly classical idea of what does the Buddha look like, classical image. But let's go somewhere a little bit less classic. So, on the left, you'll often see especially in Vancouver, you go to an Asian restaurant, you'll often see this image, right, the fat, laughing Buddha. Actually, this is, he's called Budai. He's a semi-historical Chinese monk, often identified with and venerated as Maitreya Buddha in Chan Buddhism. On the right, well, I think a lot of people now in the West, when they think of Buddha, they think of seeing Buddhas in clubs or yoga studios, places like that. I mean, if you've ever been to Buddha Bar in Paris, it's the most incredibly large Buddha. But yeah, I mean, is that authentic? And likewise for Vajrayana practitioners. So these are both, representations of Buddha. Right? On the left, we have green Tara, kind of, relatable. Right? 2 arms, 2 legs, the right number of eyes. Maybe the skin's a bit off, but we can sort of imagine our way into that image. Yeah. And Rinpoche often says, actually, part of the skillful means of all Buddhist teachings, and by which we include Buddhist art and imagery, is that it has to be familiar enough that you can relate to it, but unfamiliar enough that it challenges your preconceptions, your fixed views, or your identity. Now, of course, on the right, we have a wrathful deity, which not something that a beginner would start with. It's fairly terrifying to look at, and I think you'd understand why you wouldn't want to identify yourself with that. There's lots of arms and heads and weapons and fire and all kinds of stuff going on. So what on earth? How do we relate to something like that? Yeah, but part of the skill, right? And again, it comes back to matching the path to the individual. So it's not as though the Vajrayana is suitable for everyone, right? Not all of us will be comfortable with this kind of challenge to our self-conception. But at the same time, for those who are able, it's a very powerful thing. And I'm reminded also of like Western art, so like Cubism. So here's Picasso. So on the left, okay, maybe just about we can recognize that left image as a woman. But if this was your visualization practice, I tried this actually, trying to visualize that image is quite difficult, right? Because it really does challenge our fixed preconceptions. And the one on the right, even more so. Yes, you can, if you know that it's the portrait of a woman, you can sort of make it out. But if you didn't know that, you'd probably think it was just a bunch of, shapes and curves and lines. So again, what degree of abstraction can we handle? How much do we need our stories to be concrete? Can we push beyond that to something that is more non-dual, more abstract, less grounded? Actually, the last one I wanted to show was these images, which are actually some art that's generated by an artificial intelligence, an AI program. And I find them fascinating because they're sort of, I mean, obviously even more abstract. It's not even clear what they are supposed to be. There's some sense that there is a person or a being present. They have a slight sense of not being very friendly. But again, very abstract. So I like all of these just to make the point about abstraction, right? Just to make the point how, what, when we think about Buddha, how do we think about Buddha? What are we relating to? Yeah, and how does our fixed way of relating, how does our demand that the Buddha should fit our preconceptions, how does that cause us problems? Yeah, so even though it's important as beginners for us to start with something that feels noble, feels aspirational, feels inspiring, right, has all these qualities, something that we should want or think we want. As we go through the path, we slowly but surely have to shrug off all concepts. And there's the famous saying by the 9th century monk, Linji Yichuan. He said, "If you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him." Yeah? So anytime we have a fixed view, a fixed idea, when we think we found him, we need to stop ourselves and remind ourselves, okay, whatever it is, this isn't it. As Rinpoche said, we need to go beyond all concepts. Yeah, first we start our path with hearing, with contemplation, with meditation, but we need to shrug these off. Then we have understanding, then experience, and finally realization. But even the understanding, even the experience, even this we need to shrug off, right? Which, as Rinpoche said, somebody asked him, well, what are some of the signs of realization? He said, well, one thing is there's no urge to write about it. Yeah, I think in contrast to many contemporary spiritual teachers who talk and write quite a lot about their experience and their supposed enlightenment, I think Rinpoche is warning us to be a little bit suspicious of things like that. And the other thing he said is, of course, one sign of realization is compassion. We've talked about that before. So we have this most precious thing, but we don't devote time to it. And it's not our body, it's not our wealth, it's not our home or our family, but it's this cognizance, right? This ability to be aware, to comprehend, it's mind. As Rinpoche says, we don't devote time to it. Why don't we? How ridiculous, right? It's the most powerful, the most precious, the most beautiful thing, and we don't give it any time. A couple more quotes from Saraha here. Forsaking genuine bliss to walk other paths, placing hope instead in what is contrived, like bees amassing honey but not consuming it, an opportunity so close is squandered. Animals don't make suffering for themselves. That's the human expertise. Rather than drinking the ambrosia of space, fixation is what we opt for. So, we've said before, we have this authentic nature, and so the question was raised, well, if we have it, why do we need to practice? Well, yes, we have it. We also have defilements, and the good news is defilements are removable. If they weren't removable, there'd be no point in practicing, so there is a point, because we can remove them. But as Rinpoche said, we should practice because as long as we think we have a problem, we need to solve the problem. All right, going back to that quote we had earlier from Nagarjuna, he said, it's not as if we transcend samsara to find nirvana. We realize that there was no samsara in the first place, right? That is nirvana. In fact, there's no nirvana either. So realizing that all these experiences, all this clinging, the very basis of all of our suffering, our unsatisfactoriness, our grasping, our hope, our fear. Now realizing that actually isn't the problem we think it is. But again, until we get to that place, we have to practice. And he also said, look, even though you already have all you need, you should long for the unlongable so that you don't long for other things. When he says the unlongable, he says, I mean, he's referring again to this Buddha nature, this state of the Tathagata, because he said, you already have it. There's no point longing for it. It's already there. Nobody can give it to you. Nobody can take it away from you. So it's unlongable in that sense. And yet, we don't long for it. We don't spend time on it. We waste our lives away with all kinds of other things. And so this precious gem goes unused. So it is important to long for it. So turning now to practice. And again, we'll talk about this much more in future weeks. We're just an introduction to this 10-second practice. We need to practice in order to regain and rediscover what we already have. As Rinpoche says, you must start by trusting that you have, indeed that you are the cabbage, right? The authenticity, truth, cognizance. Your authentic presence hasn't gone anywhere. Like washing a window or washing a cup, these things are washable because they are, by their nature, clean, right? And remember, here we're talking about the Buddha nature, the nature of the mind, right? The thing that is at the heart of who we are. And if our nature is fundamentally clean, then even though it might appear on the surface to be dirty, covered with emotions and defilements and confusion and ignorance, those can be cleaned. And that is the path. So as Rinpoche said, the path is contradictory because at the ground level, the cup isn't dirty. You have the authentic state. You have the Buddha nature, but because you don't experience it, you need the path to get back to what you already have. Yeah? So again, I won't read T.S. Eliot yet again, but this idea we end up where we started, except finally we realize what we already have. Now, how does that happen? Well, first, Rinpoche told a couple of stories of Mahasiddhas, right? So how Tilopa and Saraha attained realization. Lovely stories. I want to just offer them to you as inspiration. And also because this is the tradition, right? These are the lineage masters in Rinpoche's lineage, in the Mahamudra and the Dzogchen lineages. So he said, this can happen if the right causes and conditions are together, meaning the right timing, the right situation, the right words. It's like the story of Naropa and Tilopa. So Naropa had been attending the great master Tilopa for many years, and he'd never given up, even after going through a lot of difficulties and hardships. And during all these years, Naropa really wanted to ask Tilopa for a teaching, for pith instructions, for some path to the authentic realm. And after about 12 years, one day they were walking by the bank of the Ganges, and Tilopa said to him, I have nothing to say to you. I have nothing at all whatsoever to say to you. And that did it. That just did it, right? And wow, right, then Naropa then became really the father, handing on the whole Mahamudra lineage. And Rinpoche said, look, I know for most of us it's just a fairy tale, maybe romantic at best. And most people will think it's about some sort of revelation, but not at all. If you know how to listen and hear Tilopa's remark, I have nothing to tell you, it's quite profound. But if it was somebody like me, I would have beaten Tilopa up. After 12 years of serving you, you've nothing to tell me? What do you mean? Stuff like this. So something very similar happened to Saraha. And he was the dean of Nalanda University, which is one of the oldest universities in the world, very kind of important in ancient India. And he was the dean. Most of the students were monks, highly disciplined. Imagine the context, right? All these professors sitting there with a certain rank and position. And what did Saraha do? He's like, you know what? All these years of intellectual pursuit, It's just not leading me anywhere. So he took off. And as he journeyed, he met a woman who was making arrows. Right? She was a part-time arrow maker and a part-time prostitute. And she was shooting arrows aimlessly everywhere. It's an important detail, by the way, this kind of aimless shooting. Saraha was very puzzled, and he asked her, "Why are you shooting your arrows aimlessly?" And she said, "That's your problem. You always have an aim. I have none. That's why I'm liberated." And again, that did it, right? The dean of Nalanda, one of the most, erudite people in India, got the answer from a part-time arrow maker, part-time prostitute. So now, for us, maybe we don't have what it takes to hear the truth. Maybe some of us feel we can only receive teachings from, very high teachers, and we don't know how to pay attention to the world around us. We don't know how to receive teachings from the people that we meet, from the arrow makers and prostitutes in our world. So, if nothing else, we can practice to increase our merit, right? To increase our ability to receive teachings, to see Dharma in all phenomena around us, right? And Dharma, remember, is truth. So truth is everywhere, right? The nature of phenomena, the nature of our own minds, it's there. It will reveal itself to us if we just look. Right? But as long as we're too busy looking somewhere else, we won't find it. As Roche said, practice is getting more acquainted with, right, our authenticity. It's making it more stable. It's building a bigger picture, the presence of authenticity. And indeed, as we, over our practice, increase our merit, one day perhaps we will be able to get it in just the way that Naropa and Saraha were able. But it's important to acknowledge that the world has changed, right? We're not living in the sort of environment that was around a couple thousand years ago. And Rinpoche said, the image of a small mountain hut on Hashan is gone. For some of you might wonder what that is. I found an image, one of the classic Chinese mountain images. This one is by Shi Tao, who was a 17th century monk, calligrapher, and landscape painter in the early Qing dynasty. But as Rinpoche said, the image of a small hut on a mountain, that style of being alone, maybe that was possible 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, but now we need different kinds of mountain. We need different kinds of isolation. I mean, in the past, he's also talked about the challenges of even doing a 3-year retreat. Where yes, it's a wonderful opportunity if you have it, but for so many people who've completed the retreat, they then come to the ordinary world again, and the challenge of reintegrating and rebuilding an ordinary life is just so great. Now, Rinpoche is actually saying now he has a preference instead that people integrate their practice into their worldly life from the beginning. Right? So he has, for example, something called the Dharmaga, which your practice commitment is to practice 2 hours every day. And there are other masters who have even longer practice commitments. Like I know Jimmy Kens Rinpoche and Tukapama Wangyo in France, they have a 4-hour daily commitment. Yeah, but the point is having a daily practice, even if it's not as long as that, at least that's a way to ensure the integration rather than go off on a retreat, have some wonderful experience and insight, and then come back and not be able to integrate. And Rinpoche said, so maybe different kind of mountain, different kind of isolation. And he said, the best is, again, the 10 seconds. Just be aware of what's happening right now. Yeah, no judgment. And he said, yes, I mean, this 10-second practice, just being aware of this moment, this nowness, it's nothing special. That's it. Just do it once a day. You can't get more normal. You can't get more authentic. And it'll help you overcome stress. It'll even help you become a good human. Although, as he said, it's like a bonus. He says like a throw-in, like if you buy some electronics at a US store, they'll throw in a charger or something. It's not the real thing. So again, also worth reminding, right? Because I think so many of us, as we said in the first week, we do worry a lot about how to think about Buddhist ethics, how to think about being an engaged Buddhist. Not that these things aren't important, they are important, but as Rinpoche said, it's secondary, it's not the real thing. And so this 10-second practice, it's simple, right? Nothing to memorize, no precepts, it's not religious. Rinpoche said, modern people are scared of precepts. You don't have to sit straight, you can do it in front of a temple, you can do it in front of a movie theater. And he said, when you practice, sometimes it's good to make a really big deal out of it, right? To infuse it with some sort of sense of meaning and purpose, some ceremony, some ritual. And other times it's good to do no big deal at all. And for those of you who do Vajrayana practice, you'll know this is familiar practice advice. And he said, look, my job in the beginning is I want you to want the 10 seconds. Yeah, and a very important example, he said, you might be addicted to social media, but you know what? You can do the 10 seconds. And by the way, when I say do the 10 seconds, don't stop what you're doing, right? Don't stop your chatting or your texting or whatever it is you're doing. Do your 10 seconds while you're texting, while you're chatting, and just be aware. This is what's happening right now. And so what will that lead to? Well, he said, initially you'll laugh at yourself, but that's good, right? You're not occupied. You're not obsessing. It's your first taste of authenticity and normality. It's your first taste of freedom. Actually, I want to close by reading a story. It's by Ben Zander and Rosamund Stone Zander from their lovely book. It's called The Art of Possibility. It's called Rule Number 6. So 2 prime ministers are sitting in a room discussing affairs of state. Suddenly a man bursts in, apoplectic with fury, shouting and stamping and banging his fist on the desk. And the resident prime minister admonishes him. Peter, he says, kindly remember rule number 6. Whereupon Peter is instantly restored to complete calm, apologizes and withdraws. The politicians return to their conversation, only to be interrupted yet again 20 minutes later by an hysterical woman gesticulating wildly, her hair flying. Again the intruder is greeted with the words, Marie, please remember rule number 6. Complete calm descends once more, and she too withdraws with a bow and an apology. When the scene is repeated a third time, the visiting Prime Minister addresses his colleague. My dear friend, I've seen many things in my life, but never anything as remarkable as this. Would you be willing to share with me the secret of rule number 6? Very simple, replies the resident Prime Minister. Rule number 6 is don't take yourself so goddamn seriously. Huh, says the visitor. That's a fine rule. And after a moment of pondering, he inquires, and what, may I ask, are the other rules? There aren't any. So with that, I bid you farewell. I'll see you if you're coming to the questions and answers in 10 minutes. Otherwise, look forward to seeing you next week. Okay, so welcome back. We'll do some questions and answers. As I say, there's some questions we definitely have room for more. So if any of you still have questions, feel free to put them in the chat or in the form. So first, there's actually several questions around kind of teachers. So let me see if I can answer those. Firstly, from Michelle, I've heard teachers speak of leaving an imprint, even if we do not understand the full extent of teachings on emptiness and so forth. How can we know if our aspiration is strong enough to make an imprint? That's a good question. And I guess the point is it reminds me of when I teach leaders, and in leadership there's this idea that you want to be a good role model, right? Well, same with parents. You want to be a good role model to your children. You stand for certain things, and you want your people or your children to see that you are being intentional, right? And so the question is, well, how much of the time are you role modeling? And the answer is all the time. Yeah, same as a parent. Your children are watching you all the time. Now, you may not be intentional all the time, so you may not be aware that you're role modeling, but you are. Right? So I think in answer to your question, we're practicing something all the time. We have some kind of aspiration all the time. It's not a black and white thing where it's on or it's off. And likewise, it's not as though there is an on-off thing with, your practice or your aspiration having an imprint. Everything has an imprint, right? Which is part, actually, if you were of a mind to get a bit paranoid, which hopefully you won't, but the other way of thinking about it is this is the way interdependence works, right? Once you understand the Buddhist way of thinking about karma, we are continually, every second, every microsecond, creating karma, right? We are always doing things with our mind and our body and our speech non-stop, which is most of the time we don't even know, right? And so we're creating all of this huge flood of karmic kind of imprints in the world, all these causes and conditions that are sort of radiating outwards, like throwing a stone in a pond, and all these ripples are just going off into life and touching other people, touching the planet. And of course, many come back and touch us or touch other people, and they respond and touch us and so forth. But just to say, every moment is a chance for practice, right? So as we were saying earlier, this idea of really training oneself to see that every moment one can see the truth. Every moment, the teachings are available. Even in the Theravada, I think that they'll say, as long as you imagine that the Buddha is in front of you, there he is, right? Especially in the Vajrayana. So that's another question comes later about gurus, right? The most important relationship with your guru is the one that you have in your mind, right? And if you have your guru close in your mind, then you're never separated from him. Right, so just to say, Michelle, I don't think it's black and white. I think everything is good, and the more, the better, right? And I think it's a little bit like those stories of Naropa and Saraha. Yes, there are special moments and tipping points where we can receive the truth in a full way that we might not have been able to prior, right? We might have just had a more distant, maybe more emotional or more intellectual understanding, and not really a direct experience. And that, by the way, for those of you who are practicing Tibetan Buddhism, Vajrayana traditions, that's one of the reasons there's so much emphasis placed on the nindra, because it's not that people are trying to make you do all these endless practices. It really is, back to Michelle's question, it's building up the capacity so that you can actually receive the truth. Because if you keep going with your path, eventually you'll receive higher teachings, you'll receive, more direct instructions of the nature that Naropa and Saraha received. But the trouble with those instructions is, as you can see from those two examples, they're so easy to miss, right? I mean, if somebody came up to you and said, I have nothing to tell you, I mean, is that going to give you some breakthrough insight? Right? If you met somebody on the streets throwing stones and saying, I'm not having any goal with where I throw my stones, you might just think they were kind of making a random mess, right? Our ability to receive those teachings such that they can have a transformational impact on us is really dependent on us having really prepared our minds, right? Which is why the ninja is so important. Um, Next question. Is there any conflict between taking teachers from different lineages in Tibetan Buddhism? Um, well, I mean, I can't speak for what other teachers or other lineages might say, but as I mentioned previously, I mean, Rinpoche is from a lineage that is the Rime tradition, right, in Tibetan Buddhism, which is an ecumenical or integrative cross-lineage, right? He holds all the lineages himself. He's received teachings from lineage masters from all the lineages. I think he says he has something like 60 different gurus. I mean, some of the great masters have had more than 100, right? And actually from all of the lineages. Now, I think it perhaps is a little different if you're trying to say, no, but I actually want to have a master that I'm choosing to follow for specific instructions. And I mean, there indeed, there may be some benefit in sticking with one. I mean, if only because I think the very human, back to ego again, I mean, Rinpoche jokes, sometimes people like to follow multiple masters because then you go and ask the first master, well, what should I do? And the master gives you an answer and you think, don't like that answer. So you keep going around different masters till you get the answer you like. I mean, and regrettably, there are some people who do that. Obviously, that's not particularly helpful. Um, I think Rinpoche, I mean, he has been asked many times, is it not just different teachers, but different practices, right? So many Westerners now go around collecting empowerments for these different sadhanas and other practices, and they never have time to actually do any of them, right? I mean, because to actually even do a basic version of a sadhana practice usually takes 3 or 6 months in retreat, right? So how many of us have even done that with even one of our sadhanas? But, and so Rinpoche says, part of the danger then of following too many different sadhanas in these Tibetan practices is that you never get any good at any of them, right? So you become like an amateur at everything, which doesn't really help you get better. So I think there is, I mean, it's not a bad thing, he said, try it out for yourself. Maybe it'll work for you, right? But I think his general sense is it's probably better for us to really push on one thing, not least because, as we've been saying so often, you'll pretty quickly come up against some resistance, right? You'll come up against places that your ego isn't happy, and you'll think, oh, I want to give up. Maybe there's something else that's more fun, more interesting, more up my street, dare I say it, more fitting, more authentic for me. Very easy to delude yourself that way. So yeah, I wouldn't, I think the spiritual supermarket approach probably is not so helpful. But to answer your question, no, there's no conflict. And in fact, it can be very beneficial and in fact can help if part of your mindset is a little bit tribal. Because I think you do also see a lot of people nowadays with a sense of, oh, my teacher's better than your teacher, right? I think it's easy to get into that, which is also extremely unhelpful for your path. Also from Michelle, how can one steer away from nihilism and maintain joyful effort? Is having difficulty with this a sign that our practice is not yet deep enough to hold uncertainty? Oh, it's a good question. I'm not entirely sure what you mean by holding uncertainty, but as we said before, I mean, in the Mahayana, diligence and joyful effort, it is a practice, right? And so by definition, you're not expected to be great at it at the beginning. And I mean, I've seen Rinpoche so many times in public teachings or in private sessions where people will come to him with these, very ornate practice questions. And he'll so often end literally by saying, just continue with your practice. And I mean, I hate to be sort of disappointing, But really, that's so often the answer for most of these practice-related problems. It really is just to keep going. Now, having said that, and we will talk about this next week, and Rinpoche has also said this quite a lot recently, part of the challenge in the contemporary West is a lot of students are impatient and don't want to spend the time to establish the view. They don't want to understand um, the basis for the practice. And so the problem is what then happens is all kinds of doubts come up during practice, which if they had done a little more time in hearing and contemplation and meditation, would save them a lot of, difficulties in the practice itself. So yes, when I say continue with your practice, especially in Tibetan Buddhism, but I think actually in all traditions, it's not as though we have a dividing line between, study on one side and practice on the other side. And we'll see this next week when we start to talk about Vipassana. I mean, Vipassana really is about seeing the truth. And yes, you can do that on a meditation cushion, but you can do that by reading a book or having a structured contemplation. I mean, there are many ways to practice. So I think part of the problem also is we have attachment to a certain form of practice. As Roche said at the very beginning of this teaching, right? He said, it's really what we should be wanting is the aspiration for this state of the Tathagata. It's not about specific homework, as he put it. Yeah, so I think the specificity can be a hang-up for us. Okay, Tracy. How do you think modern technology might affect the path, since teachers can now impart teachings from afar in a way that may seem even more interactive and intimate than had all been together in one room? I watched a lineage ceremony done remotely, where ceremonial gestures, such as offering and receiving the kata, etc., was simulated. The students seemed very moved despite the screen and the technical glitches, which separated them from their teacher. Yet it was odd. Do you think teachings, rituals, transmissions, and so forth will ever be able to be given fully online? How might this affect the Dharma and its reach? Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. Actually, Rinpoche himself I know he's asking his colleagues, his fellow lamas in Tibetan Buddhism, because I think there's very little agreement on this. Because I think the more conservative teachers are of the view that all this virtual stuff really doesn't count as an actual transmission. Yeah, there's too much going on where the voice is being transformed, into an electrical signal and then digitized and then sent somewhere and then recreated. And, is it still in any way the same original voice? Can we say there is actually a transmission taking place? Now, I know some teachers are saying, well, it counts if it's live, but not if it's recorded. I actually Richard taught on this a few weeks ago. I was just looking at my notes. He said, you know, the transmission controversy is still on. He said, it would help if you can also receive transmission from somebody else local who has received it, a local instructor or whatever. I would encourage you to do that. And he said, of course, there's this tradition of the ear-whispered lineage. And he said, I don't know anything about the science of the internet, so I can't say yes and I can't say no about whether or not, a transmission or an empowerment or anything over the internet would be considered authentic. And he said, some would say that the voice you're hearing is not my voice. Right? And he's also said, even previously, he said, even the Dalai Lama would give large transmissions where there were so many people in the audience that amplification was needed. I remember she's done this too. And so, many people in the audience couldn't hear him directly, but only through the loudspeakers. Others were monks working in the kitchens preparing food. They couldn't even see him. So should they be considered as having received the transmission? All to say, I think the teachers themselves have not come up with a point of view on this. So far from me to try and give you an answer because I don't know what they would say or will say. Um, but, I mean, of course, if it were to become acceptable, then yes, that would broaden the reach of the Dharma. So yeah, I think it's hard to know. Okay, another question from Carlos. He said, my interest for Dharma started when I came across Rinpoche's videos on the internet years ago and then his books. Since then, I felt more and more connected to him. I wanted to start practicing Nindro at a regular basis, but there's no Dharma center close to where I live, and I had the opportunity of engaging in the Brazilian Drukpa Kagyu Center, sort of online Sangha. I took refuge and started Nindro, again, online retreats, but I still feel Sons Khyentse Rinpoche is the guru that inspires my true devotion, even though he's not my root guru. So can you talk about pursuing a formal path of practice in a lineage, which was casually brought in by life instead of chosen from a spontaneous sense of familiarity? I mean, Rinpoche, his answer for things like this will be, he'll say, this is karma, right? This is causes and conditions. This is just the way your path is manifesting so far. And the fact that you have the aspiration you do, keep on aspiring. And I think particularly in Vajrayana, especially if you do any practices, invoking the presence of the teacher, you can substitute any teacher. You can even substitute more than one teacher, right? So I think that there should be no reason from a practice point of view that it will cause an issue. And remember, as Rinpoche said many times, the most important thing is mind. So as long as you're clear in your mind what you're doing and which teacher you wish to hold in the center of your mandala, it's totally up to you. So there's no problem with that. And again, I think Rinpoche himself has often encouraged students to see other teachers, to take other teachings. And I think he sees no conflict. So, and at the same time, I'd say, Carlos, given that you have an aspiration to meet Rinpoche, I'd continue to aspire, right? And hopefully, when COVID passes, next time he's in Brazil, hopefully you'll have the opportunity to meet him in person, and then you can ask him yourself and see what happens. Okay, so that's the ones in the form, not so many. Then Dominique has a question online saying, is the different size of the Buddha fields, or the story I told about Sanjay Kamagawa and Kuntuzek, is it determined by their accumulation of merit and the power of their vow as to whether or not it becomes thumb size or infinite? Actually, Dominique, the point of that story was not so much that one was big and one was small, but that actually they were both beyond description. It's not, that the whole idea of size is one of the dualistic defilements that we're trying to overcome. So there's a lovely Zen koan, actually. I want to see if I can find it for you. Yeah, it's called Shuzan's short staff. Right, it's from the Gateless Gate, and so here it goes. Shuzan held out his short staff and said, "If you call this a short staff, you oppose its reality. If you do not call it a short staff, you ignore the fact. Now, what do you wish to call this?" So it's a classic sort of Zen teaching, but very much pointing to non-duality, right? Pointing to the breakdown of language and concept, right? And I think that was Rinpoche's point in sharing that story, is that we want to be able to go beyond any limited ideas of time or space or dimension that we're currently constrained within. Now, it's very hard for us to understand that right now because we are constrained within them, but that's the aspiration. Okay, so there are now currently no more questions, so I'll pause just to give a moment to see if anyone has any more. And we can just practice our 10 seconds. But no. All right. So in which case, I will bid you all farewell and look forward to seeing you all next week.